I think what I'll share today fits really nicely with what we've heard Jolivet and Greg present, as Greg talked about Black excellence, Black educational excellence, and looking at excellence. And Jolivet talked about cultural education. And so a big piece of that for me, what I'm walking away with, which dovetails into my work, is a key linchpin in Black educational excellence and cultural education, and it's that of the teacher. And Greg mentioned culturally responsive teachers. And so my work is focused on meeting the needs, the professional, the pedagogical needs of African American pre-service teachers in their educator preparation programs. So I come to this work with some large ideas about what we know about African American educators who are practicing now. And I use the word paradox intentionally. So we know that largely African American educators have a long documented history of success and effectiveness with children, particularly African American children, Latino children, children of color, and particularly children who are attending schools in low income areas. And that goes across the board. When students have African American educators, we see improvements in academic achievement. We see increases in high school graduation. We see increases in African American students who are placed in advanced placement, honors, tracks, magnet school courses. And we also see increases in school attendance. So across the board, we're knowing that when teachers have an African American, when students have an African American teacher, the likelihood that they experience positive educational outcomes increases. But at the same time, we've known that for a while. What we are learning now, and this actually isn't new to African American educators, what we're learning now is that, one, the pool of African American teachers is steadily declining. And it's declining from those who are in the profession now, who are leaving, and those, the numbers are declining from those even entering into the profession. So we are at a steady decline of African American teachers. And so one could just look on the surface and target issues of retention, but now we're looking beyond recruitment. We're looking towards retention and looking at the particularized experiences that African American teachers have that create opportunities for them to experience alienation such that they leave the field. And so what's just coming out now is the idea that African American teachers experience a myriad of alienation at the intersection of their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status. They experience that alienation professionally, and that contributes substantially to the attrition rates of African American teacher. And what I'm learning now in the study that I am working on now, I'll share in a minute, it may be complicit in the limited number of African American students who are deciding to pursue teacher education, pursue education as a career choice, and stay in it. So even some of them start, but they don't continue in a teacher education program. So just from a macro lens, that's what I'm coming in thinking about African American teachers. It's a paradox. So, and I use this picture, I love this picture. Very briefly, this is a picture taken in the 1800s of educators from the Freedmen's Bureau who came to the South to teach formerly enslaved African Americans. If you can see this, what do you notice about this picture? People up close, what do you notice?
They're all women.
They're all women.
And that the black teachers are in the back.
The black teachers are in the back. They're all women. And I'll read to you. I took this picture from We Are Your Sisters. It's an edited compilation of narratives from black women in the 19th century. And the caption that goes with this picture says this: in this 1863 1963 photograph of Northern teachers in Virginia, the black women were relegated to the back row. Although the names of some of the white women are known, the blacks remain unidentified. That was in 1863. And a lot of that similar types of alienation, being relegated to the margins, being silenced, is happening to our African American teachers today, even as we know about their documented excellence. So that leads me to thinking about, what does this mean for pre-service teachers? And pre-service teachers, I mean those who are in undergraduate schools at universities, and they're considering or they're pursuing degrees in education to go out and teach. If we know that exists for African American teachers, what kind of experiences, what are things that's happening to our pre-service teachers? So what we know here is that for many African American students who decide to pursue careers in education as teachers, they do so with a sincere calling. They feel called and compelled to not only teach, but teach in areas where there are going to be predominant numbers of African American children, or they're intentionally focused on teaching in urban areas. And I think that's important because we have a number of existing teachers, we always have shortages in those schools. So if we know that African Americans who are attempting to pursue education, they want to go specifically in those areas, it would seem likely that we do all we can to meet their pedagogical needs. We also know about pre-service teachers that teacher education matters for them. In 2014 and then again in 2017, with research looking specifically at black teachers and black women teachers, we found that those who had some form of teacher preparation, including some type of student teaching experience, they were much more likely to remain in the classroom than those who had not. But here that's broad, and what we further need to look at is the kind of teacher education experiences, and that's where I'm going in my work. The kind of teacher education experiences that our African American pre-service teachers have. And finally, we know that African Americans who are pursuing careers in education as teachers, we know that they experience in their teacher preparation program, they experience some of those same things related to alienation, isolation, hypervisibility, at the intersection of their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status, while they're going through their programs. And what's important for me here is particularly when they are engaged in learning experiences where the overall goal is to learn something about diversity, social justice, or multiculturalism. So pretty much all schools and colleges of education today have some type of diversity requirement where all of their teacher candidates have to take, really it boils down to just one course about diversity or multiculturalism. And so I'm really interested in looking at my African American teachers' experiences, teacher education broadly, but particularly as they are engaged in learning about and thinking about race, racism, privilege, social justice education in these courses. Because we know that the curriculum in teacher education has been overwhelmingly designed to cater to young white women, to get them prepared, some sort of ready to deal with African American children. So that leads me to the purpose, again, of this study is to examine African American pre-service teachers' perspectives on their teacher education experiences, particularly related to learning experiences where the focus was on race, racism, social justice, diversity, multiculturalism, which we have all kind of homogenized, particularly in teacher education, right? And so I'm asking, what do the life histories of beginning African American teachers reveal about their teacher preparation experiences as it relates to learning about race, racism, and social justice? So just, I'm going to talk briefly about kind of the theoretical frames and methodology that kind of guided me here in this work. I'm using critical race theory and portraiture methodology together to inform the methodological decisions, and the analytical frames. Now we know that critical race theory and portraiture methodology, they have their own kind of separate tenets and practices. But in 2007, Vandika Chapman looked at each of those, looked at this portraiture methodology and this critical race theory theoretical framework and found points of overlap that were really important and really resonated with the study that I'm doing. So those points of overlap dealt with the importance of context. Critical race theory and portraiture methodology privilege context and the particularities of context. Also the roles of the researcher. So both critical race theory and portraiture methodology demand that the researcher move away from supposed positions of objectivity and neutrality in their research. Also the idea of interdisciplinary approaches, commitment to social justice, and the idea of counter story and goodness. So those things kind of link me back to Jolivet and Greg with this search for goodness. And the goodness here is that we have African American teachers in the classroom. And so my work is with 5 beginning African American teachers. They have 3 years or less experience. They come from different places. I have 3 who went through traditional teacher education programs at PWIs, predominantly white institutions. I have 1 African American male who attended an HBCU, and then I have 1 African American female who went through an alternative certification route. And I think it's important because all of those contexts are different. All of them, though, experienced their teacher education preparation in the South. And so I used the Zoom model analysis, which allows me to systematically look and analyze their life history narratives. And we know what can typically happen when people tell their life histories. It can be a very linear, started from the bottom, now we're here type of method, right? But with the Zoom model analysis, what's really great about this analysis for me, but it allows me to interrogate the silences, what's being said, what's not being said, the large, what's going on in the backdrop of these teachers' lives that may have some sort of indirect effect on their perspectives and their experiences. So just briefly about the teachers, I'm focusing here on 3 teachers. I'm pulling 1 from a PWI, traditional 4-year preparation program, 1 from, and that's Thaddeus, and then Darvin attended an HBCU, formal educator preparation, 4-year program, and then Candace, who attended a PWI, but her bachelor's degree is in business, and she went the alternative certification route to teacher education. For the sake of time, I am not going to read parts of their portraiture that I capture. So with portraiture methodology, it allows you as the researcher to compose a narrative that is kind of like a portrait of who our participants are. And so for the sake of time, I won't be able to read that. I will tell you though that both Thaddeus and Darvin, when I asked them specifically how do they see themselves as an African American teacher or as a teacher who is African American, they readily clamored to the idea that they are an African American teacher. And as they talked about that, they linked that to how they saw themselves as supporters of African American students, how they saw themselves as role models. Candace, on the other hand, she was a bit hesitant. And she immediately saw herself as a teacher who was African American, but then she put that in the context of where she was currently teaching. She was currently teaching at a school where she was one of 2 African American teachers in a predominantly white school. Although 40% of the students were African American, it was still predominantly white in terms of administration, in terms of the culture and climate. So I thought that was notable. So the one finding that I'm going to highlight here, because I think it has implications for teacher education, is this large discourse that I've theorized as doing diversity in teacher education. And it encapsulates how these 3 participants talked about and described and elaborated on their experiences and what it meant to learn and talk about and gain some type of knowledge on race, racism, social justice in their diversity and multiculturalism classes. And so I'm going to do a little bit of reading here to elaborate more on this dominant discourse of doing diversity in teacher education. I noted that it meant 4 things. It meant limited intellectual engagement. So doing diversity in teacher education for these participants meant limited intellectual engagement. It meant hypervisibility. It meant silence, and it meant double taxation. So there's one that I'm just going to elaborate on a little bit more. As I said, it has implications for teacher educators. It's this idea of limited intellectual engagement. So across all the novice African American teachers, a dominant discourse emerged that described the scope of the teachers' learning experiences involving critical issues related to race, racism, and social justice in education. So first, limited intellectual engagement included non-confrontational awareness activities when they were in courses focused on diversity and multiculturalism. The teachers talked about how they were given materials to read about an issue or two related to diversity in education, and then just write a little reflection. I do a little critique about it with no further action or dialogue. So Zach described it this way. So I asked him, were there any kinds of discussions about race, racism, or culture and quality, any of that in your diversity course? No. We had articles that you could do an article critique on. Whenever anything, from what I remember, anything when you were talking about a cultural or ethnic, any kind of basis for that, any question, it was like you read an article and you did a critique on it. You never really had an open dialogue about something like that. Bevan sums it up this way. So I asked, so in this classroom management course, did at any time the issues of race, racism, and culture come up? Yeah, come up in discussions, assignments, or activities. He says, I think we did, I don't remember, we might have did like an assignment on that, but it wasn't like a nail in the coffin, like we studied it in depth at all. Because they were talking about the general happy-go-lucky kids that never had any problems. In addition, limited intellectual engagement included diversity talk framed around the idea of learning about different cultures and religions and abilities, not about oppression, inequities, privilege, or power. So one participant, I think this is Dalvin, he says, I asked, in your teacher education program, what kind of things did you talk about in that diversity class? Oh, different religions, where people's backgrounds come from, why they do this, why they do that, there's certain things that you may be able to do at school, but you can't do them at home, why students react in a certain way when you say something, all that stuff occurred in there. And finally, limited intellectual engagement included silence around and an uncritical acceptance of negative generalizations, characterizations, and assumptions about African American students, communities, and parents. So Candace elaborated on this in depth in one of our interviews. She says she had to watch a video in one of her classes. She says, and one of those videos that we had in my class, my teaching diverse populations class, showed it was a white Caucasian professor, and it was about gang violence in African American communities and how these children wouldn't say anything. Like somebody could get shot and killed and they wouldn't say anything. And I'm like, oh goodness, really? That's not like the everyday. Okay, this does happen, but you're not going to get exposed to that on an everyday basis in an everyday classroom kind of thing, unless you go to a particular area. And I asked her, do you think experiences like this in teacher education were helpful? Like the one that I just described to you? She said, yeah, that one. I have to take it from their perspective. Maybe they're not familiar with the way children may approach them. So I say, okay, maybe it's benefiting them. This is clearly not benefiting me. Did y'all have any conversations about that in class? We didn't have much conversation about it because he had a lot of videos and slides he was going through. Okay? So this discourse of doing diversity in teacher education as it meant in terms of limited intellectual engagement, for my participants, they indicated that it wasn't helpful. They indicated that it did not move them past an awareness that they already knew about to action. It did not allow them to capitalize on the insights that they have, the race-based, culture-based insights that they have. It did not allow them to translate those insights into practices that were going to be beneficial and productive for students. So what are the opportunities here? What are the implications for teacher educators? So we know that opportunity exists for teacher education programs to better engage and meet the pedagogical needs of African American pre-service teachers. So what that might mean is a shift. One shift is from a focus on diversity to a focus on justice. In many teacher education programs, what we have right now are programs that have crafted beautiful mission statements that tout the idea of diversity. We appreciate diversity and social justice, but those terms have become so ubiquitous that they mean nothing, or they mean only cultural celebrations. There is no opportunity for intellectually rigorous engagement in concepts related to diversity that will push African American teachers more towards making those connections between theory and practice. So they're coming in with all these experiences, with this insight. They need opportunities, they need intellectual study wrapped around a lens of justice that can help them catalyze their insights into action. And I'm also thinking that it means a shift from a focus on awareness to a focus on action, which kind of dovetails with the first shift. So there is this large kind of, let's just make teachers aware. Let's just make pre-service teachers aware of what's out there. So there's no interrogation of why it exists. There is a large emphasis on what exists. And even that is very generalized, as Candace noted. It is very extreme case, so it's not particularized at all. So no interrogation of the why in any ways that would implicate race-based inequities and racial oppression. And finally, I'm thinking that for teacher education programs and teacher educators, there must be an enlargement of the focus in our teacher education curriculum, even around opportunities and studies of diversities from a mono perspective, which is largely Eurocentric, largely designed to cater to the safety and fragility of white teachers, to a multi-perspective, one that incorporates, not even incorporates, but is framed around diverse Afrocentric perspectives and philosophies and theories of education and educational achievement. And so I'll stop there so we can have time for Q&A.